I'm David Ainsworth, because I haven't been introduced on the architecture, and I'm here to introduce Frank Filskow of Make Architects, but also I was actually the client or the development manager of the project and we're both here on behalf of Old Park Lane Management, and Tim Sketchley, who is our client on that. I think must be people in the room at the moment, because I know that he was going to be here. So I'll do a brief intro for Frank, and then what we'll do is Frank will do a presentation on the building and the project, and then we'll have a Q&A. So whilst he's speaking, and as we go through, do use the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom page here to put forward any questions you might have, so that when we come to the end of this, we will keep to an hour, so but hopefully after we've done the formal presentation, we'll have the opportunity to have a proper chat about it and get some of those questions out. So Frank, let me introduce Frank Filskow. Frank was Foster's, but was part of the team that formed Make in 2004. And he's worked in both Hong Kong and the UK, and starting predominantly with quite a few residential projects, moving into commercial over the last 15 years or so. We've been working together since about 2009. We started working on a building over in the West End, in Leicester Square, actually. We called it LSQ, which we completed together for the same client, in fact, as 20 Ropemaker or Park Lane Management. So that was completed. That's now the Hearst headquarters building in the West End, and it's the one with the Lego store in it, which is usually how I describe it. But it was a great project, working together with a very almost the same team all the way through, as well as the architect, but all the other members of the design team moved on to 20 Ropemaker after that. So 20 Ropemaker, we worked together since 2015, and through more detail of that later after Frank's done the presentation, I think, but it's been a fantastic project. We're currently on site, just to give you some context, and with a major pre-letting of the building to Linklaters. So Frank, can I ask you to do your presentation, and then we'll talk further?
Absolutely. And I would say that the work on Leicester Square in letting a West End building really informed our approach to this building on the City Fringe. So I'm just going to share the screen. So hopefully that is the presentation now. So 20 Ropemaker is a 26-story commercial building on the City Fringe, which is just started on site this year. And we're very excited to see that get completing over the next 2 or 3 years. Here we are looking over London, looking south, and you can see here in the middle the location of the Ropemaker building. It sits off to the side of the main city cluster on Moorgate, just south of Old Street, and you can kind of get a sense of Finsbury Square here in the foreground as a kind of an interesting area which is growing in popularity, especially because of the advent of the new Crossrail link, which comes through from Farringdon and Moorgate and through Liverpool Street, which is really transforming the connectivity in the area. So this is what the site came from. It was originally 2 separate buildings, Finsbury Court and 20 Ropemaker. Between them, about 12,000 square meters of office space from the 70s and 80s. Buildings that had reached their end of life, the mechanical equipment and the kind of the floor plates were becoming outdated, and relatively small buildings compared to the kind of buildings people really look for now. Especially in the context of the other Ropemaker building next door, which was recently completed, and CityPoint building. So the assembly of those 2 sites creates the opportunity, and it's an interesting location because historically that location around CityPoint Plaza has been a kind of cluster of lawyers, quite a kind of slightly forgotten area on the edge of the City Fringe. But it sits halfway really between the main city cluster and the new emerging cluster around Old Street. And we found that very interesting from the onset, because it led us to start thinking, who would the tenant be? Would it be a lawyer? Would it be a city operator wanting to take a less central site? Or could it be a tech operator with a proximity to Old Street? And we had all three occupants in mind from the onset. The opportunity, again, is kind of in between. We're not actually in the St. Paul's view from Westminster Pier, but we're just to the side of it. But we did take the view that the scale of the building should be of this kind of medium scale building, as 25, 26 stories, which is similar in height to the CityPoint Plaza building, but obviously a whole scale down from the main city cluster buildings and some of the taller buildings at Old Street. So a tall building, but nonetheless not a very large building on the kind of London spectrum. However, we also wanted to make sure that it was a respectful approach, and we had a successful ride through planning. We took this rule that we kind of made off to the side of St. Paul's, the formal view. We're in the consultation area. We decided that this sloping plane in the view from the base of one of the smaller towers at St. Paul's to the existing CityPoint building suggested a line which we should not enter in terms of creating a change to the skyline and the setting of St. Paul's. So that cuts across the top corner of our site and started to inform the thinking about the opportunity. The other big constraint, though, is the nature and character of Finsbury Street and Moorgate and Finsbury Square, which is a conservation area, and has a very distinctive 10 and 9-story set of buildings, mostly in stone, that frame those streets. So we wanted to respect that as well and establish and work with a very consistent approach to the well-established streetscape on Finsbury pavement. So we had this transition in scale between a potentially tall building and the lower height on the street. And so that started to suggest this idea of a stepping form, which cascaded up from the lower height through a medium step to the higher height. And that created a viewing plane, which also meant that the setback plane that we set out from the opposite side of the street kind of determined the pitch of that slope, and we started to establish the form in that way. And then actually looking at it in the round, we also found that we were able to start thinking about the relationship that the few buildings around CityPoint Plaza, Ropemaker Place, CityPoint Plaza itself, and the new residential tower off the right, whilst they all had similar heights, we wanted to create an articulated skyline and a balanced cluster view from the quite important setting of the Honorary Artillery grounds. So this view here shows how we then stepped back down and created a four-finger, kind of four-layer stepping building. So then thinking about the architecture of that and how that might start to become a building, we also started thinking about how buildings in this location would be perceived. And we wanted to create a building which had a different identity to the traditional central city locations, which are usually fairly simple forms, single identity buildings. We wanted to create a building that had a smaller grain, a finer grain, in particular because we're actually in Islington. And we wanted a building that had a grain that felt like it was part of Islington rather than part of the city. We didn't want to create an impression that the city was marching out into Islington, but rather that Islington had its own character. And we wanted the idea of a building being a cluster of almost extruded street buildings of a smaller scale to start to represent the idea that perhaps it's a community of businesses rather than a single identity. And that the potential market for us might well have been a multi-tenanted building, and that would give us flexibility. So we separated the forms into discrete elements and started creating these setback planes, which were expressed as intermediate layers, and alternated the tone from a light and dark tone to create quite a heavily articulated facade. And you can see how that sits in the streetscape. Unfortunately, this view we glimpsed briefly, but since then the new Deutsche Bank building is going to take away this view. But it's an interesting viewpoint that illustrates my point, that when you look away from the city cluster here, you can see a building that has kind of affinity with the smaller scale buildings in your memory of Islington. The interesting thing about the site is that it's kind of the southern half nearly of an entire city block. So the north elevation of the site is effectively a series of party walls bounding onto the other half of the block, which means aspect is all from the south, east and west, and the northerly aspect is not so quality, especially at the lower parts of the building. So we made the decision to locate the cores and all the circulation on the north elevation of the building and have a south-facing floor plate, not least because a central core would create office space facing north, which would have looked into the backs of the service yard or the other buildings, which would have not been very attractive, and it would have been quite a narrow donut in that dimension. So we have an offset core, and that immediately created a new challenge, because it meant that the structural strategy for the building was very asymmetric, and the bracing system of the building, normally provided by the core, would need to be supplemented with effectively a braced facade. And we came up with the idea of these ladder frame facades built into and integrated into the south elevation, so that the whole facade itself was a structural element bracing the building. And we worked closely with the facade engineering and the structure, and brought together a design which was wholly coming together of the energy story and the structural strategy to kind of really drive the architecture out of kind of the fundamental engineering principles and sustainable principles of the building, rather than thinking of it as external dressing, seeing it entirely as a functional response. So we have these horizontal banded windows, significant amounts of solid cladding. We wanted to maximize the extent of solidity in the facade to reduce the thermal gain and lower energy consumption, and a deep reveal also providing natural amounts of soda shading, especially on the south facade, to reduce heat gain from the sun. And the horizontal windows maximizing the panorama. And you can see on the right hand side of this slide how the structural beams are exactly mimicked by the solid cladding. So it's inherently a very sustainable approach by reducing the amount of glass on the south-facing facade and on all the facades. But also we designed the building very much from the inside out, and I think this is becoming a much more important way of thinking about how we design buildings, especially moving towards thinking about well-being, sustainability, about thinking about the user experience and the energy profile of the building. So where we put the glass, we want to maximize the amount of glass in terms of the glass that's productive for the fantastic views and natural daylight. But we don't want to maximize glass where it does not provide those benefits. And we did a lot of mock-ups and testing on this, both from an energy and visual perspective, and established that a sill height of around about 600 millimeters, just a little bit lower than the desk, was an optimum balance in reducing the amount of glazing, whilst without restricting downward views. People do like to look at the busy streets, but then horizontal windows which open up the lateral views. And in fact, that solid panel at the bottom 600 millimeters reduced the energy consumption coming in the facade by 12%. And that meant we could make the similar reduction in the amount of solar control in the glass to have higher G values and clearer glass, and actually let in more daylight than we would otherwise do with a fully glazed facade. So by reducing the amount of glass, we actually increased the amount of daylight without restricting any of the views. The other important factor in the views was the mullion positions. And so we worked hard to minimize the number of mullions, and we moved to a 3-meter grid with actually 4.5-meter bays, so that the amount of lateral interruptions when you look across the panorama was reduced to the bare minimum. And you can get a sense of how that worked and how that could be adapted to internal partitioning. We also introduced natural opening windows to get natural ventilation in the corners of every single finger. So throughout the floor plate, there's large opening windows which you can open up and get access to the open air and that connection, that very important, mostly psychological connection with the outside, because the filtered clean air that we have in the building is arguably better than the air outside. But we all know that the benefits of opening a window in terms of the psychological comfort are phenomenal. So by having opening windows and large panes of glass, we get that connection to the outside, which I think is really important, without limiting the flexibility of tenants to subdivide the space. And that really drove the architecture. As you can see how the architecture is entirely a language of response to that strategy. And then as we developed the detail of our facade and started investigating materials, we found that natural limestone was actually going to be the lowest carbon material we could use for the building. It was quite interesting because we looked at all sorts of materials, modern materials and technical stones, and found that simple cut natural limestone, which we're getting from Europe to avoid the transport costs, was an extremely low carbon response. And what's more, actually, the client was extremely pleased because it's also an incredibly durable, long-lasting response, and it has a sense of quality to it, which was also going to become a very important part of creating a building of significance in this part of London. So everybody embraced the stone, as did the planners, and it obviously fitted well with the context of Finsbury Square. And I think, being natural stone all the way to the top of the building, we think, and we say this with caution, it might be the first building in natural stone of this height since St Paul's was actually built. So we're very excited to be doing that and taking forward that detailing. The other feature of the building is the quite complex geometry that the site had. It has a tapering shape, which is not immediately apparent from the three-dimensional drawings and views that you've seen. But actually, the south elevation is not parallel to the north. It's not a rectangular site. And to resolve that, we started to realize that by absorbing the geometry within the site, we could fold the building form away. And in the red triangle here, peel back from the public street and significantly enlarge the public domain and create a vast improvement to the junction of Finsbury pavement between Ropemaker, and setting back almost 11 meters on the corner to create significant public domain. It also kind of changed the profile of the building and the views, and it meant that from the views to the south, where the grid of the streets have changed, it seemed to fit more comfortably within the views. You can see here the view at the top shows the existing condition before the building was demolished. And if any of you remember this building, the pavements here are extremely small and very tight. And it's quite a congested point, and you can see all the people not on the pavement and quite happily walking around on the road, but maybe they're not so happy. And we've then introduced a new, significantly larger paving area, potential for outside seating on the south-facing corner, and the introduction of a street tree to try and continue that sense of trees, which you can see as you go up Finsbury pavement. The frontage, then, you can also see that opening up that you see in this view on the left-hand side of the screen here, where you see the new tree. And then in these drawings, you can see how we have introduced retail frontages all along the Finsbury pavement on the ground floor. And then above them, we've got a single floor of affordable workspace, so that the two-story provision, office and retail provision, is about engaging local retail and working community uses on Finsbury pavement and keep a really lively street that appeals to all. That means the centre of the building becomes the main office entrance, and we devoted the entire central part of the plan to the office reception area. By having the cores locating in the back, we've got nearly 11,000 square feet of lobby space and two separate entrances. The lobby space initially in our thinking was a very generous space, and we wanted to have an entire community of facilities in there: cafe spaces, meeting areas, lounge areas, function space, and try and create a semi-public communal space where all the different business users in the building would come together, as well as public events, to create something like a business square, or more than just a single building, almost a village. A market square perhaps would be a way of thinking about it. But the two entrances have also proved to be very useful as we started to talk to tenants, because it also meant we had the opportunity, when we did start talking to a major tenant, to take half the building, over half the building, nearly 2/3 of the building, to actually have their own entrance and still have a separate entrance for the remaining building community. It's also important to note that the whole south elevation faces onto the square. It's the natural point of arrival, and we've got a dedicated and high quality bike entrances as one of the front doors of the building, which we see as an equally important high quality entrance of its own right. And we were able to locate the servicing in a very compact service bay on the top left corner here. Sorry. So you can see how the identity of the building, the arrival sequence, is entirely driven by the architecture, the substantial structural frames coming down, forming these two portals, which take you into the two entrance points, which we're now dividing into 21 and 22 to give two addresses. So we had flexibility from the outset. And I think flexibility is very important when thinking about buildings in terms of sustainability in the future. We all know how quickly now the future and market trends can change. But that sense of arrival being driven out of the architecture. This is the quality of the cycle entrance. You come down, it's obviously durable, but you come down the same materials of the rest of the lobby spaces, and you come down a ramp, stepped ramp, which takes you down into a 2-floor cycle parking and health and changing facility in the basement. Quite a substantial offer with hotel quality shower and changing facilities, secure bike parking, including visitor parking, as well as accessible bike parking and parking for disability vehicles as well. So really an all-encompassing access point for all, which takes you in through the lower levels and back into the main lobby, so that everybody enters the building through the same part of the building. So it's not a back door at all. And I think that's very important and becoming increasingly important. So as we started to think about how the building works and functions, we started to think about what it is that tenants would potentially want in a building like this. And through other work we've been doing, we obviously would champion the location, the identity of the building, the versatility of the floor plates, and the normal commercial criteria that you investigate. But we started becoming increasingly interested in talking to tenants about the well-being of their staff, the quality of the environment that they work in, and not just that from a moral perspective, but also from a productivity perspective. More and more clients that we're working with are realizing, especially where we've worked with direct tenants, that the happiness and happiness of the staff and the quality of the space is having a direct impact on productivity, which is an economic benefit. So we started thinking about how we could maximize those features. And of course, we've already gone down the path where we were committed to a very sustainable design. And from the onset, we targeted BREEAM Outstanding, which I'm happy to say we're still on track to achieve. And we're very pleased about that. But as well as that, the more soft benefits and the well-being. So we're now going through Wellbeing Gold certification for the building. It's a sustainable location, walking distance from many transport nodes, but introducing other aspects of well-being, not just the quality of the floor plates, the views, the daylight, but also the opportunity to get outside and have roof terraces and balconies, and to come and work in a building in a thriving part of London where there is amenity on your doorstep as well as in the building itself. Achieving that wasn't actually straightforward. We designed a building that had no large roof, and so it was obvious opportunity to create these fantastic roof terraces. And by layering the form as we did, we were able to create 7 roof terraces. But the design of the roof terrace is built into the base build, and we're actually fitting these out to provide this not as decorative greenery to look at and to perhaps do something at the end of the day, but actually a very thoughtful and detailed analysis on working space during the day for people to go outside and have a change of environment, whether it's 2 people having a meeting, somebody working on their own quietly, or an event, or a seminar, or a client event. And in order to do that, we had to make quite a radical decision to put all of the plant on one of the mid floors, And we had to assess the value of losing a mid-floor of the building of around about 15,000 square feet in terms of to give back the added value of the roof terraces. And by distributing roof terraces throughout the building, that has proved to pay off, because it became a very attractive prospect for tenants as we went into the marketing. So you can see here the roof plan. We gave over almost all of the roof that we could. The very top roof obviously is not accessible. We've got 2 roofs which are biodiverse, which also incorporate tracks for the BMU. But below that we have 7 roofs which have a diverse range of different working spaces. And some of these roofs are over 6,000 square feet. So these are substantial areas. And you can see we anticipated small pocket areas to be in, as well as large function spaces. And all of these roof terraces sit above the kind of view line. And this view shows we are very fortunate, because as I was saying at the beginning, we're just off to the side of the formal St. Paul's view corridor. So that airspace to our east on this site is kind of enshrined in policy, and the building turns and faces that and gives that view to all the occupants on kind of every 4th or 5th floor as you go up the building. And we do think that's going to become very important. And we've learned now in our recent experiences over the last 6 months how your workplace, the quality of your workplace, access to the outside is becoming increasingly important. We knew this already, but it's been underscored by our experiences over the last few months. People who've been stuck at home in small flats working in London without access to the outside, with mental health issues, people working at home in environments not really designed for working, without proper conditions or lighting or furniture, and without the change in scenery that is really important. So whilst this has been emphasised, we've been on a journey for the last several years now, realising that people's lifestyles, people's lives as a whole, do not finish at 9 o'clock in the morning when they start work and restart at 5 o'clock at the end of the day. The next generation of employees that tenants wish to recruit expect their lives to continue 24 hours a day, and they expect that to be enabled. So why wouldn't you have a yoga class on the roof terrace during the day to allow workers to take a break? And in fact, all the evidence is it increases productivity in any case. So the building form also has another significant benefit in providing a diverse range of floor plates. At the lower part of the building, they're quite large at 26,000 square foot, and they taper off and get to about 8,000 square foot at the top. And that in itself is a sustainable measure, because it allows the building to attract and appeal to different tenant types and changing needs. It's got 2 zones of lifts, and in fact this has been put to the test, because our new tenant that's coming in, which is a lawyer, and we'll talk about that shortly, is taking the bottom half of the building up to level 14 to get the perfect amount of floor space, but they have flexibility to move into different floor plates in the future, which has proved to be a great success. You can see in grey the plant floor in the middle of the building, and we were able to flex the lifting because of the zoning, because we were quite robust with our lift calculations to accommodate that. And I think that again is a good example of future flexibility that the buildings need to consider. So these are the types of floor plates. You can see the core is to the north of the site, and you get a large continuous amount of floor plate to the south, views all around, and you can see the roof terraces off to the sides on some of these terrace floors as the building sets back. And one of the cores drops off about halfway up. This is a typical floor. There are also a number of features about the floor which we think we were really pleased to incorporate into the design. First and foremost, one of the primary fire escape staircase is right in the middle of the south facade. We put it on the facade and we fully glazed it. The intention is for that staircase to become the day-to-day communication staircases that multi-floor tenants would use to move up and see a colleague 1 or 2 floors above. And we wanted to make it a feature, a quality environment with fantastic views, so that when you go and walk up a couple of floors, it's a healthy option. It's much better than going in the lifts, especially now. We know that there may be some times when lift numbers are restricted, but also it's an attractive option, and it gives you an opportunity to have a different experience, and hopefully more people will get drawn to that location. But also the stairs in the cores themselves on the north elevation have windows. They have natural ventilation and glazed windows, and so that we wanted all of the secondary spaces in the building to be equally as good quality as the primary office space. So we also have, wherever we could, we put windows in the toilets, in the staircases, to create a really quality environment. And the other feature we introduced was balconies of a smaller scale to the terraces, about 6 meters by 3 meter, kind of almost residential scale, slightly larger, small scale spaces that are outside facing the sunshine, which I'll talk about in a minute. And you can see how the elevation of the building features on the way that the office floor space is divided into zones and interrupted by the glazed staircase running up this slot here, and the balconies, which are all double height, in this slot here. And that also, we found when we started doing space planning tests, was very appealing to the tenants and space planners in providing this natural zoning and community spaces, so that building the larger floor plates could be divided into separate kind of working hub units with breakout spaces around the staircases and the balconies in between. We also, because of the double structure, where we had twin smaller columns, we had natural flexibility to allow tenants to start reconfiguring the building and take, for example, a 4-floor zone like this and create their own staircase, and to link the roof terraces down 2 or 3 floors down to create views and start to promote highly collaborative and creative environments with sight lines and interfloor connections, and even better access to the sunshine and daylight, so people can understand the weather wherever they are in the building. It's proved to be unnecessary at the moment. Our staircase has been, there was discussions about doing this with the tenant, but actually the glazed staircase we've got in is providing that functionality. So we've anticipated that and actually limited the need to spend additional cost and knocking out holes in the floor plate after we've already built them. But this is the way the floor plates look. So you can see the fire escape stair here, and I think, you know, this is really important to say this is a fire escape staircase, and I think we need to move on from thinking about fire escape staircases as dumbed down, low cost concrete staircases with cheap mild steel balustrades that are considered only to be used in the case of emergency. We now know that tenants take 2 or 3 floors. They want their staff to be free to move between them, and they want to promote people using staircases and going and enjoying the sunshine for a moment, and using all of those bits of your day to create you know, a quality working day experience. And the balconies are part of that story. So by locating them in both of the slots on the east and the west side of the building, and alternating them as 2-story high balconies, we were able to create effectively double height balconies on virtually every floor, and coupled with the roof terraces, almost every single floor has access to the outside, which we think is really important. Because we do believe, and we've been doing research with this, talking to major tenants across London, that the employees' health and well-being is becoming absolutely crucial and high on the agenda for large corporates and small corporates alike, because recruitment fundamentally starts with talking to next generation employees who expect this. They expect to have a high quality working life, and the most talented employees who come to London have demanding requirements and are highly sought after, and this is the least we can do for everybody in London to provide really good quality healthy places to work. And I think one of the things we've started to say is that I think sustainable buildings will need to look a bit different. We had initial discussions with the planners, which were quite conventional conversations I've had over the last several years. It's a tall building. Wouldn't it look more elegant if the elevations had a vertical emphasis? And we understood that from an aesthetic perspective, from a townscape perspective, but we worked closely with the planners just to explain why our elevational design was not an applied pattern language. It was actually an integral part of an approach to sustainability. And by having horizontal windows, we were able to provide a better, more sustainable building that provided a better quality environment for users. And it creates a very unique character to the architecture, which we're proud of, because we think people should see if buildings are changing, if buildings are using different, they should see that and understand it. And I think it's become part of the identity of the building, which the tenants will be proud of as well. And I think just coming back to the kind of present day, I think this emphasis on thinking about the quality of office spaces as places for people, thinking primarily about the workers in these spaces in cities, is never more important than it's been today from the perspective we all come from. Cities, at the heart of these great cities we have, and London is a fantastic place, offer something that nowhere else can do. And it's about bringing people together to allow people to socialize through their work, be creative and be productive in environments that are stimulating and very high quality, better places to work than working at home or working remotely or being shut off. But equally good at looking after your welfare and well-being as sitting in the garden at home. And I think that's going to be forever with us after these last few months. And hopefully this building is in a good place to address those needs. So that's kind of brings me to the end of the presentation. And perhaps, David, we can have a little chat about your initial thoughts.
Right, can people hear me? I hope you can. So Frank, thanks very much for that. It really brought home, it reminded me a lot of how exciting the whole process has been, especially those early meetings where the shape started to emerge. It's just amazing. I'll just add a little bit on the commercial side, just a bit of context for those in the audience who are interested. We went through a process with Old Park Lane management to assess the options, as Frank suggested at the beginning, and we looked at height, looked at uses, looked at all of those things, and came up with the basic approach that we have. We then got approval to go to planning, and then we went ahead speculatively with the project. So we didn't have the pre-let in place before we started. So I think it's worth emphasizing that because that was a strong decision at the time. The location next to Crossrail was a very important part of that. But it's worth saying, of course, Frank and I went out to Hong Kong literally about 2 months before the Brexit vote, and then that happened. But you know, it was a great call to go ahead spec. With as far as the occupier is concerned, we did talk earlier on to another large occupier, but Linklaters was something that emerged in about probably over a year ago now, 18 months ago, and a slow romance between us as they took an interest in the building and then decided that it was the building for them. I'm going to give a proper credit here to a great friend of all of us, Richard Beestill, who, as I'm sure we all know, died last week. Just such a great guy. I'm really going to miss him. And he acted for Linklaters, TP Benner acted for Linklaters on their interiors. And his enthusiasm and belief in the building was really important. Frank, I think you'll agree.
Yeah, absolutely.
it was very special, and so I don't know quite how to put this, but I just wrote his name down, so I must talk about him. But he was very important, and we built a great relationship between the two teams, which I think everybody on the call who knows how these things happen, you have to have the chemistry between the teams, because there are some long meetings involved, and you have to take views and build trust in each other. So as we said, they took levels up to level 14. They got some options on 3 more floors, and we made some pretty significant changes at the entrance for them, and also the lifting was a critical part of this, but there was enough resilience in the system to allow them to have what they needed and what we needed for the rest of the building. So the rest of the building is available. My agents would want to tell you, and we'll be marketing that in due course. But we're busy designing the entrance hall for the new 22 Ropemaker at the moment, and that will come out as part of the next stage. There are some questions which I've got here, but do put your questions in on the Q&A button. Frank, if you're pleased, our client Tim has set us an exam question, or set you an exam question.
Yes, I was just looking at that.
About breathing. And he's made the point, can't breathe is the expression for 2020, both for the Black Lives Matter, but also for the virus. And his general point was, what can architects do to allow the city to breathe going forward?
Well, I think it's an interesting, we reflect on the discussions we had about the air quality on the site, and a very interesting trip we had to go and visit Dyson and hear about the work they were doing on air quality and how that might change our building. On the one hand, we learned about hospital grade filters that you can put into buildings, which obviously do go into large hospitals to clean the air. On the other hand, we learned about some interesting kind of dynamics about the kind of nature of air quality and the fact that the poorer quality air in cities kind of sits up to about the kind of 9th floor, which was fortuitous. And so that kind of idea that we start building spaces in the city, in our buildings, up on the roofs, actually, once you get that kind of above that kind of 9-10 story line, you're out in the open air, in the fresh air, where it is high quality air, and that's fantastic. And the opening windows and the terraces are really a part of that. So I think that will be a very important factor. I think there's a lot of discussions about open plan and cellular office in relation to kind of the air quality and kind of and the pandemic. But I think, you know, there's an interesting point there. I don't think it changes the debate that buildings need to be able to do both. On the one hand, closed environments might seem safer, but on the other hand, they may be worse because, you know, larger open spaces allow for air to move. So, and the role of the office as a kind of collaborative and creative environment, you know, obviously a big factor in that. But I think getting up and into the air of buildings, I think, is really important. And I think we advocate and believe that the city buildings provision of roof terraces should become an absolutely consistent approach to all buildings. In the past, I've liked to try and we haven't been able to do it on this site quite, but I like to try and give over 100% of the site back to either public domain or roof terrace. And we've nearly done that. And I think if we can continue to do that, we have a responsibility to kind of green our cities. It was also interesting to hear in your, you know, the last City Architecture Forum talk a little bit about the importance of roof terraces and the importance of horizontal roof greening rather than vertical greening as a meaningful and maintainable provision in cities. So absolutely, I think there is a lot to be learned. I think everybody's doing, well, we're certainly in all our buildings, we're looking at opening windows now. If anything, just to give versatility. It's not necessarily anything about one size fits all. So I think that's all part of quite a complex formula in terms of providing both natural ventilation as well as treated and filtered air conditioning. Perhaps I'll move on to talk a little bit about Richard's question here, asking about a make look. we do get this question. I think we'd like to say there isn't a make look, but as you've rightly pointed out, there are some consistencies. This building is an antecedent of our 5 Broadgate building and our London Wall Place building, and what it has in common, which is something we believe quite passionately, is that buildings start life as solid buildings, and windows should be introduced into them rather than glass buildings. And we find no example where the solid building doesn't perform better than a glazed building. We haven't always done it, and there are sometimes in some cases where high performance glazed facades do work quite well. But however, we were fortunate enough to be given the latitude to develop a more complex facade with our client on this project, and to kind of reach for that higher goal. And I think buildings being solid is really important. And we now know that if we look back over buildings that have stood the test of time, buildings that are being successfully reused and refurbished, actually it's the more solid buildings that are, and the older buildings and Georgian buildings that are still working for us. So I think that's what we see in common, and the idea that you design buildings from the inside out, and that the glazing and the fenestration, the facades of buildings are coming from the functions inside the building, naturally means the buildings have a distinctive look. And I think that's what we have at this building has in common with some of the other make buildings that perhaps Richard's thinking of.
I can't see any other questions. Maybe you can, Frank. I've got some sort of disability.
No, just a couple at the moment.
Yeah. So I think it's one of the interesting things we might talk about is this. You've mentioned it, but we haven't really talked about it. This is over the border in the London Borough of Islington, so it's was a planning authority which was less familiar to us, and in fact, this is the largest Islington consent they'd actually granted. So it was something quite important for them. So one of the elements we had to consider was their planning policy on affordable workspace, which was at that time a sort of emerging policy in this location rather than absolute sacrosanct, and it's something that we had to consider because as a percentage of the building, but also as how it actually works. But it might be worth just talking a little bit about how we found a solution to that.
Yeah, I think it's going to become an increasingly important thing, and I think we're starting to see an increased synergy with developers and projects we're working with you on, and an understanding of how to deliver a more diverse range of office space. I think there's also a maturing kind of coming through policies. The affordable workspace policies, especially in Islington, they have similar policies in places like Hackney, where some of the northern, the outer city boroughs, worry about gentrification, and at a kind of commercial gentrification where big business is pushing out smaller businesses. And there was a lot of regeneration projects in the last 2 decades where kind of leftover low grade workspace, like typically archways or small kind of B2 kind of semi-industrial workspace, small units, producers, makers, have been replaced by largely residential developments and regeneration. So that, I think, has led to the kind of increased number of affordable workspace policies, but those policies themselves are now emerging as an understanding of that actually a building like this, which may have a large international tenant and other tenants in it, also depends on local industry. Small creative businesses support the larger businesses, You only got to look at the model of kind of Google. That in fact, a large number of Google's software and work is actually done by independent small companies, and actually having them close and having them in amongst the big buildings of the city is really important. So I think we should continue to embrace it. There's obviously been a huge popular move towards kind of co-working and collaboration space. I think that's going to reinvent itself over the next few years. But I could see these things coming together as spaces for obviously along with the new planning policy on kind of high street uses, where the smaller businesses can come together, whether they're in shared environments or lower cost environments or collaborative environments, which I think are really important. And I think as we see small businesses now blurring the boundaries between being producers or retailers or businesses, we should fully embrace that kind of provision of office space in these buildings, which we started to do here, and I can see on projects now going forward, it's getting larger, and I think it's totally doable.
I think it's doable within the definitions. It's just getting the definitions right with local authorities.
Yeah, I think it's about flexibility, isn't it? I think the broader definition of alternative workspace, I would perhaps describe it. It doesn't necessarily have to be cheap. It doesn't necessarily have, we all know that WeWork is not actually cheap. It's just you only rent a small amount of space for a small amount of time, and it's flexible. But actually, pounds per square foot is perhaps not the way to think of these type of business spaces. And it's about thinking of business space as a service, and the way that serviced space can actually be quite affordable if it's managed right by sharing. And we know that on this building, we've looked at various options for having flexible floors, which could be either the main tenant's expansion space, or they could be collaboration space, or they could be used flexibly. And I think it's part of a sustainable agenda as well, in terms of reducing our total build of office space by creating more shared facilities. And I know that on some projects we're looking at now, we're saying, why can't we have significant shared facilities which are for the benefits of the tenant, but they're also open to the wider community? So there's creative production spaces or event spaces that you shouldn't have in your own tenancy privately and unempty and sitting there empty for 75% of the time. They should be shared between different businesses, if possible.
So I think we're beginning to get to the end. I think I'd like to just shout out to the rest of the team. I think in your team, I think Rob Lunn and Catherine Edwards were fantastic all the way through. There's lots of other people as well, so I know that I have, but I just want to highlight them because they've done a great job. So Hilton Moran on the M&E, Waterman's on the structure, Townsend's on the landscaping on all those terraces you just seen, which was very important, and WT on the cost. So, and as I said earlier, those teams have worked together, and with this client, we've travelled together for more than 10 years. Well, yes, in my case, more than 10 years now, and it's been a fantastic ride. So. And that's how these buildings get built. So currently on site, just to clarify, despite the picture behind Frank, that isn't there yet.
Soon to be there.
Skanska appointed and Kelbray digging holes and piling at the moment. So it is happening. We had a short break in the early part of COVID, but it's all powering away now, and with extra huts for more space for everybody. So it's and due for completion and handover in early 2023. So still stuff to do, and still quite intense stuff on detailed drawings going through, but that's development for you. So and hopefully everybody's seen tonight a little bit of a microcosm of a great building coming to life.
Yeah.
So thank you, Frank, for that.
But I'd also like to just, if I can just add to that, to say, I know Tim's on the line, but also just to say to both you and Tim, I think one of the most important parts of this project is the space that you as development manager and Tim as the client on behalf of Old Park Lane and have given us in actually allowing the debate and the discussion to really take place about what leads to quality, testing us on that. Definitely not taking every answer that we gave first, but actually I think the things I'm most proud of in this building have been enabled through a very open-minded and forward-looking approach from a client perspective. And I think if we're going to build great buildings in the future, it's really important that developers are brave enough to kind of go one step beyond whatever they did last time, and every building should be a next generation rather than a kind of repeat formula, and especially now. So thanks to Old Park Lane and yourselves.
Well, okay, thank you, Frank. This is a very public thank you. So the digital lecture series continues. So the City Architecture Forum has got through lockdown with this remarkable series of lectures, and they will carry on as does the virus, unfortunately. So on the 1st of September, we have one on 100 Leadenhall Street with SOM. So that'll be the next event. So I think that's probably the end for today. So thanks everybody for attending, and see you next time.